We've seen a lot of protests lately, haven't we? They never seem to end. How many protests can you recall from the last year? Quite a few, right? The NFL players kneeling. Teachers walking out in Oklahoma and Kentucky. Students walking out just on Friday. Did you hear about the protest this week? I'm not talking about the students. I'm talking about the two men who were arrested for trespassing while they waited in a Philadelphia Starbucks. And they were waiting for a colleague to arrive. And they were trespassing because they didn't buy anything. Well, I usually wait to order when my colleagues arrive. And I heard that this was really a short time before this altercation occurred. And they were black. The response by the community was to stand outside the Starbucks and to try to keep them from making any money on Monday. Now, whether you agree with that or not, Starbucks is acknowledging that there was bias in the employee's decision to call the police. And they also said that every company makes mistakes, but great companies are the ones that learn from those mistakes and take appropriate action. They say they want to make a place where everyone is welcome, but to do that, they have to widen the circle. We all encounter times in our lives when we encounter or when we engage in fear of the other, of those who are not like us. Fear of the other drives us to make decisions about where we live, about where we work, about where we worship, about where we shop. And I think that this is something that we should do as individuals as well. When I was confronted in that seminary classroom, I had a couple of options. I could have interrupted back. I could have insisted that my knowledge was valid. In fact, it was more valid than her idea that knowledge doesn't have to come from a place of academic integrity. That's the reason I claim the expertise. And I was telling the class that my idea wasn't necessarily my own, but it came from someone else that had expertise in the subject, and a part of me still believes that was my reasoning. But that's not what I did. Instead, I took a moment. I took several moments, actually. And I thought about what she said. Did I act in a way that was biased? Well, yeah, I did. And that is what Jesus is confronting in this moment. Jesus was confronting the bias of the Jewish people in the crowd. The Jews were God's chosen people. They were called to be a light to the nations. They were called to be the ones that showed the world how God wanted people to act toward God and toward each other. And they took this job seriously. They believed in their mission. And their solution to this was to put a fence around themselves. Sometimes this fence took the form of a walled city. And sometimes it took the form of excluding those who might dilute the culture and the heritage of the people of God, a cultural fence, if you will. And because of this, faithful Jews were not allowed to associate with people who were not Jewish. In the Bible, these non-Jews are called Gentiles. Gentiles were to be avoided if they could. They had to deal with them, of course, in order to make a living, but they kept it to a minimum, and they were especially careful not to associate with the worst of the outsiders. These included Samaritans, lepers, soldiers, the sick, the poor. Contact with any of these outsiders would jeopardize their ability to enter the temple. And so it was just best to avoid them altogether. And so they set up a cultural fence. Now this was the standard practice for centuries, and it was accepted as the normal way to live as the people of God. If you were faithful, you hated Samaritans. That's just the way it was. You didn't talk to them, you didn't have them in your home, you didn't hire them. You didn't buy their goods because they were cheats. And they were dishonest, and they were dirty, and they were thieves. They were murderers. They weren't worth the air they breathed. And Jesus just said that he was going to include them in the people of God. Actually, he said that there were other sheep that were in a different pen that he was going to lead. That he was going to go outside the fence and include people that the people of God had shut out. He said they will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock, one shepherd. He was going to widen the circle. One shepherd for one flock. One shepherd for one people of God. The privilege that the Jews held on to for so long was just reduced to nothing. Now, mind you, the people of God still remain the people of God. The Jews still held on to the title of the children of God, of God's chosen people. They still had all of the covenant promises. Nothing had changed in their status. It just wasn't exclusive anymore. Jesus just widened the circle. And I'm thankful for that. Because I'm not a Jew. I'm a Gentile. Before Jesus, I could not be included in the people of God. I would be in another pen. I would be outside the fence. I'd be looking in. I'd be wishing that I could have what they have. I needed the circle to be widened, to be standing here today in a sanctuary proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. I benefit directly from this action. We all do, actually. And yet I do not feel like I'm standing on the outside. I'm not excluded. And I have rarely felt excluded. But there are those that do. Who are the ones that are standing outside the fence? Who are the ones that we exclude? Who are the ones that Jesus would talk about today? Who would Jesus widen the circle for? Would Jesus widen the circle for those who are economically challenged? Who seek to make a better life for themselves? But who also carry a different skin color and maybe even a different language with them? Would Jesus widen the circle for those who struggle to feel included in a country that they've always lived in? Whose parents and grandparents and maybe several generations have made their home here, but who have always struggled for equality? Would Jesus widen the circle for those who are different from us because of whom they choose to love? When we're faced with the idea of the other, we have a hard time widening the circle. When we look out of the fences that we build around us, we have a hard time imagining that what we have isn't ours exclusively. And when we think about whom we might include in the circle, it is that very thought that gives us privilege. We get to decide if we're going to let others in. We have the power to make that decision because we are on the inside. Which means that Jesus is talking to us. You know, we used to be the outsider. We used to be the Gentiles that weren't included. Now we're the insider. And Jesus is calling on us to love. And what is love? Love is laying down our lives for our brothers and sisters. That's what we learned in 1 John. Jesus laid down his life by dying. And maybe that is what we're called to do. Or maybe we're called to lay down our privilege. Maybe we're called to lay down our status. Maybe we're called to lay down our exclusivity and widen the circle. What is love in today's world? I'll leave it there. I'll leave it to you to get outraged. I'll leave it to you to take a moment, a long moment, and to think about this deeply before deciding what to do. I'll leave it for us to learn from our mistakes and to take appropriate action. Because what would Jesus say to us today? Who would Jesus tell us that we should include? Who are we supposed to lay down our lives for? Are we willing to widen the circle? Would you pray with me, please? God, in moments like these, it's difficult for us to look within. Or if we've already done that and we feel like we are accepting, there's still room for us to grow. But even if we stand by and do nothing, then we aren't helping others to grow as well. So lay it upon our hearts what we need to do to widen the circle, to include others in your kingdom, so that they can know the joy of being your people.